Thank you for taking the time to watch our Measuring and Managing Supply Chain Performance webinar brought to you by the Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute. Our host for the session is Maria Rey-Marston, Managing Partner with MRM Plus Partners and instructor for our Measuring and Managing Performance in Supply Chain and Logistics Operations course taking place November 5th through 7th on the Georgia Tech campus. Maria also teaches our Demand-Driven Supply Chain Strategy course as well as several of our custom courses in Latin America. She has a PhD in Performance Management from the Cranfield School of Management, a Master's of Science in International Logistics and Supply Chain Strategy from Georgia Tech, a Master of International Affairs, a Science and Technology Project Management degree, and a Bachelor of Science in Economics. Maria has an academic, consulting, and applied research background. Her research and consulting focus is on the design and use of performance management systems, both within intra-firm processes and for inter-firm relationships. Her academic and teaching activities are centered on supply chain strategy, outsourcing, and inter-firm relationship management and the strategic connection between supply chain and financial performance. With that introduction, I will turn the session over to Maria.
Hello everyone, wherever you are. This is very exciting to have this webinar as a brief introduction to our upcoming course on managing and measuring supply chain performance. This is really a topic where every supply chain leader and every person that works in the industry really cares about. And I think over the last few years, with the explosion of data and the explosion of information, all the management of reports and key performance indicators and all the decisions that have to be made in order to improve supply chain really makes this topic applicable and really relevant to all of you. What we're going to see today, as I mentioned before, is a description of the course and a brief summary of what it means to measure and manage performance in supply chain. And as I mentioned before, driving performance is every leader's decision, is every leader's top job. So the argument here is that for this discussion is not only about how to design and how to create or implement dashboards for performance measures, but also how to influence that performance through the processes that actually generate that improvement on performance. The discussion for today will be based on the two key aspects of the course that we're going to have in November, which is measuring performance, which happens at a resource level, both in terms of productivity, in terms of cost and quality. And we're also going to take a look at how to manage performance and see how that performance takes place, both with new processes and new designs. The structure or the scope of the course is going to get started on how do we get aligned our sets of performance measures with the key goals and the key challenges of any organization. And the discussion, which I think is going to be familiar to most of you in the audience, really begins with a critical question that says, what do we really get paid to do? Answering this question, you may say, let's go back to the basics, and it's really not only about having KPIs, but understanding what do we get paid to do as an organization. If you ask a logistician or a supply chain manager, what do we get paid to do? They will say that we get paid to do more with less, with fewer resources, with less cost, to do it faster and better, with better quality, with more speed, with more accuracy, and in general, to drive a higher level of success in the overall organization. If you take these key aspects of what performance means, not only in supply chain, but almost in any process in the organization, this actually translates into the fundamental types of performance measures that we see in our operations. Productivity metrics, financial metrics, quality metrics, and velocity or time metrics. And overall, we want to drive that level of extra satisfaction as supply chain as a function that will drive a greater success of the business. If you connect this with the fundamental tenets of competitive advantage in Porter's or in Prahalat's view of a successful strategy, really what we're doing with supply chain performance is contributing to that particular differentiation or competitive advantage as an organization and as a firm. So when we get together in November, if you're able to join us, we will take a look at how some of these aspects of performance measures are really represented in your dashboards, in your particular balance scorecards, if you may have those for your supply chain operations, and how you really are driving that particular competitive advantage for your organization. Now, if we take a quick look at the types of metrics and the types of indicators that we see in supply chain performance, every well-designed dashboard for supply chain may have at least 4 of these types of supply chain indicators. And I would like to emphasize that more than specific KPIs, what you would like to have is a balanced representation of different definitions of success that actually are embodied in these 4 types of indicators. So we will have supply chain performance evaluated from a cost perspective, from a productivity perspective, from a velocity perspective, and from a quality perspective. If we take a deeper look into, for example, cost measures, big element of every supply chain's dashboard. Every organization is making sure that the resources and the activities that we're performing in supply chain are being executed with the optimal involvement of resources, with the lowest, best quality but low cost acquisition, and making sure that our activities are competitive for the rest of the firm. In that sense, we actually are measuring things like cost to serve, for example. And in cost to serve, we're taking a look these days as what is the cost of serving some of our key channels and some of our key customers. That used to be not a question for supply chain. In the past, we used to have our total knowledge of our cost of transportation, our cost of warehousing, but probably not a total knowledge of the cost to serve a particular set of customers or a particular geography or a specific business unit. So one of the things we will take a look when we get together in November is that some of the critical KPI trends is that we're looking at more of integrated performance metrics rather than discrete process-specific isolated KPIs. We're looking at things like cost to serve by customer or cost of doing business, for example, with specific suppliers or business partners. And as a whole, certainly a supply chain leader, a supply chain manager will be taking a look at the total cost of supply chain as an integral part of the performance of the organization in the context of the financial performance of the organization as a whole. Now, taking a look at another type of supply chain metrics, we also would like to see in a balanced dashboard in productivity indicators, indicators that will show us what is the level of efficiency or the level of productivity of the resources that are being utilized within supply chain processes and functions. Just as a matter of refreshment, we fundamentally in supply chain, we utilize very few resources as categories, but very expensive in some cases and varied sources of resources. But we use labor, human talent within our processes, assets, space, equipment, and in some cases we utilize resources from third parties which will be reflected in some of our cost metrics. So for productivity metrics, we like to see indicators, for example, warehouse utilization, inventory turns, labor or human talent efficiencies that will tell us what is the degree of effectiveness and productivity of that particular supply chain operation in the context of making the organization and the business more competitive and more differentiated against the competition, adding value to customers and channels. Third category of supply chain performance metrics is velocity. And velocity is key for most supply chain processes. This is actually huge not only because of the importance of service, but also because it has tremendous financial implications. So today, speed is king in measuring performance in supply chain. We would like to track the elapsed times for the execution of a particular process. We want to measure, for example, things like customer order cycle time. We want to measure the time that it takes, for example, to bring new products and services into the organization. And we know with faster supply chains, not only we will get ahead in markets and providing better service, but we know faster supply chains have actually less capital requirements, have actually a degree of advantage in terms of working capital, less inventories in the pipeline, less assets, less accounts receivables, and possibly shorter cash-to-cash cycles, which improves the liquidity of the firm as a whole. The last category, which I hope it won't surprise anybody in measuring supply chain performance, is quality. So far we've had cost, productivity, velocity, and quality, and this is probably the icing on the cake, the cherry on top of the cake. Because here what we're saying is we want a supply chain operation that not only performs fast, that not only has great efficiency in the utilization of resources, that also acquires resources that are less expensive and used at an optimal cost. But also we want a supply chain that has a very high probability of success. What this means is we also want processes that have been designed so the output has a high likelihood of being perfect. And that's how we measure things like perfect order percentage, which is a KPI that has been around for around 30 years, and still it's a very difficult KPI to implement and comprehend because it really takes a holistic perspective, seeing the business as a whole instead of taking a look at discrete processes or discrete activities by individual processes or individual functions. So when we take a look at things like perfect order percentage, what we're really saying is, what are the chances that if we execute this particular order and fulfill this particular order, what are the chances that our organization is capable of actually delivering that order perfectly in every single aspect? So quality metrics can be designed or can be implemented with that holistic perspective, but of course there is room as well for certain other metrics that are very specific by process, and we still rely greatly on things like forecast accuracy metrics, not only for measuring performance, but also as a parameter in some cases for your inventory planning strategies, for setting up your safety stocks and other decisions. So bear in mind, these metrics are not only for measuring the current performance of your organization, but some of these KPIs are also critical elements for your future decision-making in some of the key processes that drive your supply chain performance. Another one of these quality metrics that is popular these days. It's called the OTIF metric, the on-time in full, that actually is a subset of your perfect order percentage KPI that actually says what is the probability that this organization or this operation can deliver in full and on-time orders to any of the channels or customers that we have in our operation. So in summary, when we start thinking about measuring supply chain performance, one of the key aspects here is to make sure that we have KPIs that are reflective and representative of all dimensions of success, hence the word balance, for example, in balance scorecards, which is going to be critical for some other aspects that we will cover in the course as well, that we call supply chain performance scorecard design or dashboard design, that will tell us, for example, how many KPIs or how many supply chains, how many KPIs should we have in our supply chain as well. I've been told that we were going to be receiving some questions throughout the webinar, and I just received one of the questions from the audience. And one of the questions is, where are the efficiency metrics? Where are some metrics like plant efficiencies or units per man-hour? My answer to that question is that efficiency metrics is another name to productivity metrics. And if you take a look at productivity metrics or efficiency defined as the ratio between your outputs over your inputs, in this case, units per man-hour, for example, or per line hour, you will be talking as a productivity. You will be saying this plant is more efficient than another because it generates greater outputs, in this case, units per number of utilization hours, which in this case will be your inputs. So my answer, thank you for that question, will be that efficiency metrics are the same about productivity metrics, and those will be covered as well in the design of your supply chain dashboard. Now let's go to the second aspect of this particular workshop we will have in November. The second aspect is not only about measuring performance, but managing that process of driving performance. What are some of the elements that drive? And I will say that everything will start with the fundamental design of your scorecard or your dashboard design.
So let me get back to where we left. And we were talking about the difference between indicators and profiles, and I will explain in a minute more details about that. But really it's a decision about what and which ones and how many of those key performance indicators will you keep within your operation and within your supply chain. The second big piece is to understand that some of those performance indicators must have a certain characteristics, certain properties of those indicators. And I will explain to you as well what are some of those characteristics. Hopefully when you join us in November, or if you want to do this remotely, we would like to see some of the examples of your KPIs and your scorecards and dashboards so we can collectively evaluate and judge some of the soundness of those properties of your indicators. And we will also discuss about some of the other aspects that go in place when you design a supply chain scorecard. So let's get started with the first part in this section about designing scorecards and dashboards. The first part is what kind of numbers and information, quantitative information, you will use. First of all, you will have to recognize that you may have 2 or 3 different types of sets of numbers here. One is statistics. Usually you may have some descriptive analytics. They tend to be neutral in nature. Now that we are being flooded with tons of data, we will talk a little bit about big data in class, but tons of data from activity profiles, from suppliers, from customer orders, from consumer demand. Some of that data and those reports may generate statistics and profiles that tend to be neutral, more behavioral, but really you cannot compare them. You cannot use them as basis of judgment. For example, one of those is your typical segmentation analysis, where you may have really a segmentation or a slice of your analytics that will tell you who's buying what, and you may be doing some segmentation of your information. That's typically a behavioral profile. It's not really a KPI to say that 15% of your customers are making 20% of your sales. That's really not a KPI. That's really an activity profile that is being actually generated from your statistics. But it's nothing really that you could determine or use to determine if your supply chain is working well or is not. Now, if I work on performance indicators, I may want to have things that may help me judge if something is working or not. So, for example, if I take my forecast accuracy and I'm comparing the forecast accuracy of two SKUs, I may be able to judge, for example, how good is the quality of my demand planning department, how good is the accuracy or the performance of my forecasting methods. So in that sense, some of those numbers may really be considered performance indicators because they really, even though they're activity profiles, they really help us make decisions, but they also allow us to judge some of the things that are happening in particular activities or particular processes. Now, when you pick your best indicators, and I'm not going to here mention anything about how many you should have, and if you need 10 or 15 or 100. In fact, there is just a new book that was just published a few weeks ago by the Financial Times by one of my colleagues from Cranfield University, Bernie Marr, called 25. And his book, he advocates for the best 25 KPIs you need to have as a company. Well, in supply chain, I cannot tell you if there are 25 or 26 or 24. What I can tell you is that there are certain principles that your supply chain indicators ideally should follow. Some of these indicators will be alignment. That's going to be critical. You want to make sure that the indicators that you used in your supply chain functions and processes are closely aligned, not only with the overall goals and strategies of supply chain as a whole, but also aligned with the key goals and financial metrics of the general organization. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Secondly, we will talk about the second principle, which is control. You want to make sure that the KPIs, the indicators, are actually reflecting a degree of control on that particular value of that indicator. There's nothing more frustrating than being measured by something you can't control, being measured by something that is in the control of another department. And many organizations feel that frustration and that anxiety that says, I'm being measured by a KPI that gets affected by what somebody in sales or marketing or finance is doing, and yet I'm being measured by that. So we'll talk a little bit about more the principle of control. The third principle is called lateral coherence. Critical here, because we know supply chain is a process and a strategy of many trade-offs where success in one area may mean the failure or a deterioration of performance in another area. So we need to make sure that some of these KPIs make sense horizontally, that what I'm using to measure transportation makes sense with inventory management, and what I'm using for inventory management makes sense with procurement or with sourcing. So lateral coherence across supply chain processes is going to be critical. Fourthly, the ability to aggregate some of those metrics. There's nothing worse than having a collection of supply chain KPIs that you could not see a thread from a very operational measurements all the way to the strategic levels of the organization, because the metrics do not aggregate. Actually, that makes the dashboard or the scorecard not being properly designed. I want to remind every one of you out there that may be joining us for the course in November, it is absolutely critical for you to take full advantage of the course to bring some examples of your current dashboards and your current scorecards so we can help you make sure that your dashboards follow some of these key principles and show you how can you get your dashboards better. And lastly, of course, is the principle of balance, where we want to have metrics that actually represent cost, quality, velocity, and productivity types of metrics. So when we look at top-down alignment, I usually like to start with this slide in my courses, because these are the 5 things that CEOs are obsessed about or should be obsessed about. They should be obsessed about growth, profitability, efficiency in the use of resources, liquidity or generation of cash, and overall value creation for shareholders and stakeholders. So your first question when you're evaluating your current dashboard of supply chain performance metrics is, how are my supply chain operational KPIs aligned with the 5 objectives of the C-level suite of the organization? Am I aligned to what supply chain stakeholders want to see here? Am I aligned to what shareholders want to see out of the organization? What is my degree of alignment with the CFO's metrics? So I'm going to give you a little bit of a homework after this webinar and just take some of your most used supply chain operational KPIs and make sure you are aligned with some of the growth measurements for your organization as a whole, that you have some sort of alignment with your P&L statements, with your balance sheet in terms of profitability and efficiency, that you are actually measuring speed, which closely aligns with the liquidity measurements of your company, and that you understand how EVA or economic profit is measured, and that you actually have in your supply chain dashboard some metrics that align with value creation for the company as a whole. The second principle is the principle of control. And here we want to make sure that you understand and that the measures reflect, the KPIs reflect the span and the scope of control of different areas of the organization. So if you are within supply chain, and let's say for the sake of the argument that you are responsible for order fulfillment and order entry, and that you all have responsibility for inventory planning and procurement and manufacturing planning and your overall logistics and distribution operations, it's going to be critical that when you overlay some of your KPIs on top of your organizational design, you actually validate that you're measuring individuals and functions by things they can actually control. So if you want, in November, you could also bring an org chart and we'll take a look at your KPIs, and we'll take a look at your org chart and try to understand how well your dashboard, your current scorecard, is actually fitting the span of control of each one of the individuals and the groups within supply chain. The third principle is lateral coherence. And here I'm just going to explain this with a very simple exercise, very simple example. Let's say you have a sales organization that is being rewarded right now by revenue growth. So you have quantities times price equals revenue, and that's the fundamental KPI for sales. And then you're also being responsible for supply chain planning or inventory planning, and a person is responsible for inventory turns, which is the quantities sold divided by the quantities held of a particular SKU. And then there is another person in procurement being measured by cost reduction in the procurement or in the buying of a particular item, which is the unit cost of that item times the procurement cost of that item. When you take a look at these three key metrics, the first thing that jumps to mind is that these three individuals have KPIs that are not consistent with each other. These three metrics actually are not coherent because the success of one may drive the failure of the other. So you may have somebody in procurement saying, what is the best way to drive unit cost reduction? Well, I'm actually going to buy more units. Well, if I buy more units, good for me, my cost per unit will reduce. Well, but guess what? The quantities of inventories being held may go up. So that is going to damage inventory turns for somebody else. Well, you may also say that this salesperson wants to increase price because that is the way they see to revenue growth. And even though price increase will increase revenue, that may reduce the amount of quantities being sold. Well, that may also damage the inventory turns metrics by somebody in inventory planning. So what I'm trying to say here is that we want to make sure that when you design your performance measurements and you design your dashboards, you make sure that there is some level of coherence and balancing of some of the trade-offs that we typically see in supply chain operations as they align with the rest of the business unit. The fourth principle, and something that is also going to be very critical in the design of your dashboard and your scorecards for supply chain, is the ability to aggregate some of these metrics from very functional and very specific KPIs at the process level to something that could be aggregated at the more strategic level and at the more specific alignment with some of the performance measures for the company. So when you take a look at your dashboards, we will make sure that your measures aggregate, and sometimes dashboards may look like they have a lot of KPIs, but in some cases it's not a lot of KPIs. Maybe it's the same KPI that is being aggregated from a particular level or a particular function all the way to a more strategic level. So let's say, for example, I'm going to take a metric called total logistics cost or logistics value added measures, which could be simply the aggregation of some of the local cost metrics that I may have in each one of the individual processes or functions that are part of supply chain. The last one of our principles is balance, and we talked about this before. We should have at least one of each of these types of performance measures we want to have at least one cost metric, one productivity metric, one velocity metric, and a quality metric. I'm going to stop here for a few seconds as I have received another question. And the question is, as a supply chain third-party provider in our company, what metrics can we implement as a transporter and warehouse supplier vendor for our customers? This is also a great question because if you are a supply chain logistics third-party provider, you have an even greater challenge here because you need to manage two types of dashboards. Your internal dashboard for your internal processes and operations, and you also need to have and make sure that your dashboard for those processes actually aligns and is matching the dashboard or whatever is of importance to some of your clients and customers, and make sure that your measurements at the operational level in transportation and warehousing actually align with their growth expectations, their cost measures, their efficiency measures. So you will see that you may need two sets of metrics, your internal operational ones and your business measures that you will have to report and align with the dashboards of your customers. Another question here is from somebody that is starting in the supply chain game. And the question is, could you give me a quick and dirty idea of what exactly a dashboard and a scorecard for supply chain is? And I'm going to go back one slide and basically answer you with this slide. This is a dashboard. And like a dashboard in a car, is a combination of KPIs, ideally balanced and aligned, all the principles we said before, that will tell you if you're making progress towards that goal of total satisfaction, doing more with less, faster and better in all these aspects of supply chain. So a dashboard or a scorecard is a collection of KPIs that represent all those dimensions that will tell you if you're meeting that goal of succeeding in contributing to your competitive advantage as an organization and actually performing to where you want to perform in that particular aspect of your supply chain strategy. So that's what a scorecard and a dashboard is, which is, by the way, a great question to get started with the last portion of this presentation, which is, how do we go about the design of a supply chain scorecard? And again, the goal here is not to have so many KPIs that you spend half of the day just trying to understand what's in that report. Most of the companies actually complain they have too many reports, too many KPIs that you have to take a look. And what you want to make sure is you have performance measures that really have the right scope for what supply chain is responsible for in your organization. I know we're talking about supply chain as if it's a generic business function for every organization, and it's not. In some organizations, supply chain is responsible for more things than in others. So we want to make sure it has the optimal scope for your company, for your business, that it has the right level of detail. You don't want to have too detailed information to people that want to see more aggregate data, but you don't want to give aggregate data to individuals that are only working on specific operational level functions that they really need that detail to make certain decisions. You also want to make measurements and take measurements with the optimal frequency. Too often, we are measuring things just because it's the end of the quarter. Sometimes we're measuring things because it's the end of the year or it's the end of the month. Make sure that you keep in mind that frequency is determined by the variability of the process, by the variability of the performance. If a process is more variable, you want to measure that process more often. But if a process is fairly stable and things don't change that often, then you don't want to take a measurement every day or every hour, because actually the value will not change. And finally, I'd like to show you something we call the cube, which is a particular three-dimensional design for a dashboard or a scorecard that will help you integrate some of these principles into the particular needs of your organization. So the first thing is the scope issue. You have to determine what is going to be your unit of analysis. In other words, what are you going to be measuring? Is this a dashboard for the procurement organization, or is this a dashboard for the distribution group, or is this for the whole supply chain group, or is this just for a business function or for a distribution center? Secondly is, what is the level of the detail in the activity that is going to be measured, and how often should I measure that particular KPI? I know some of these concepts may look a little bit more abstract until you start taking a look at some of the decisions and some of the implications that some of these decisions will make. For example, this is just a general report that shows you how many cases were shipped per month out of a particular distribution center. And it shows you the number of man-hours that were consumed during that particular month. If you take a look at this report, you will say that probably your best month out of the year was probably somewhere here, you know, around the June, July, where you have very low number of hours with a pretty decent high number of cases. So when you take a look at that, you can say, okay, I see the scope here is for a distribution center. You are measuring this on a monthly basis. This level of detail is not too great. It's probably for a distribution manager or for a supervisor, but it's clearly not for an operator. So you make decisions on how do you want to use this report based on who are the users, what is the scope, and what is the level of detail that you have in the information. Now, talking about the cube, this is probably not a novel idea. It actually is being reflected in different theories of measuring performance and performance management in the management space, but basically tells you that you want to have something, some sort of a design that introduces our different dimensions of performance, different contexts or different levels in which you can measure that performance. And this is probably something that is in some cases new to people in supply chain, which is different perspectives of measurement. And it may look like something like this. It says what is being measured. For example, am I measuring quality? Am I measuring productivity? Am I measuring speed or velocity? Those are the dimensions. Am I measuring those things at a distribution center level for the whole company, just for a shift, just for a customer? For example, in the case of 3PL, supply chain third-party provider, is this just for a customer? Is this just for a geography, or is this for the whole company? And who cares about that performance? Is this a metric that customers will care about? Is this a performance measure that suppliers may care about? Or this is more for our shareholders and our financial department? So once you put all these aspects of the game together, you're actually seeing here that you're actually creating a three-dimensional cube that will tell you this is the best scorecard and the best dashboard you could have for measuring supply chain performance. Our goal for November 5th to 7th, and that's why it takes us 3 days to get there, is not only to help you evaluate your current dashboard and your current supply chain scorecard, but also to make sure that you know actually how to redesign some of your particular, your current metrics and your current operations. Now, there may be different ideas, and probably there's not enough time for us to go through every single aspect that will be covered in the course, but I'm going to encourage you to take a look at the agenda of the course to make sure that you understand how the metrics that you use today, for example, perfect order, are being measured today, so you can experience and enjoy the course more. So get familiar with your current KPIs and understand, some of the interdependency of some of the supply chain functions in your operations to measure things like perfect order percentage. Also, we're going to talk about during the class how we can use this concept of leading versus lagging KPIs to use performance measures, not only to record the past, but also to anticipate the future and make sure you use your KPIs for decision making and to help you actually prepare some business cases and support some investments in future capital requirements in supply chain. Make sure you also have a conversation and an understanding of what do you do from an organizational perspective, how do you fit in the overall organization, so we can take a look at the level of the control aspect of the design of your dashboard and your scorecard. And of course, we're going to be taking a look at some of the more traditional aspects of good quality KPIs, like the SMART principles or the KISS principles in performance measures. But overall, what we want to make sure is that as you come prepared with your own metrics, with your own understanding of your organization, you actually take advantage of those 3 days at Georgia Tech here to advance the design, explore new metrics, benchmark your dashboards with other people, and actually turn some of those KPIs into valuable tools for decision making. I think I'm running out of time. It is 5 minutes till the end of the hour. I just wanted to thank everybody for participating in the webinar today. Andy is going to share with everybody also my email. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out directly to me. And feel free to send us over Twitter or over our YouTube channel any questions you may have. This is a very exciting course for us. I personally have been teaching this course for about 10 years, mostly in company offerings and different types of settings here at Georgia Tech and with our clients. And we're really looking forward to having you in November, beautiful weather in Atlanta, here at Georgia Tech. So let me pass it over to Andy.
Thanks, Maria. And thank you to all the participants in on the call. If you're interested in taking the course in Atlanta, please visit the URL www.scl.edu/MMPSCLO. That page will include more details relating to the course. It'll also contain a link that will get you to registration through Georgia Tech's professional education website. Also, we encourage you to follow us on Facebook or Twitter. We have a couple of groups on LinkedIn. You just search on Georgia Tech Supply Chain and Logistics Institute. We also have a YouTube channel where you can find this and other webinars that we've hosted in the past. Thanks again and have a great rest of your day. Bye.